Now I will say, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are very warmly welcome. I am pleased that so many of you have turned up, that so many had interest, so many that it actually bursts our Albert Schweitzer Hall, which is actually such a wonderful hall for a lecture event. But I think it was a good idea that we decided spontaneously now. I thank all of you very warmly that you were ready to give up your seats, which some of you had secured there an hour before. So now we are here. Islam in Germany is our topic, the topic of our series, which begins with tonight. And if it continues like this, then I don't really know where we should always move to. On one hand, I feel like Islam in Germany is a constant topic in the media, in newspapers, on TV, talk shows, often in conversations among friends. And we have a tradition of church coffee after every Sunday service. There was a time when, no matter the sermon, no matter the main focus of the service, after 20 minutes, the conversation would always turn back to Islam. On one hand, it's constantly discussed, but on the other hand, I've noticed that many people who are leading these discussions are often surprisingly uninformed, or informed in a way that gives me chills. I, for one, get irritated when someone reduces Christianity, my Christianity, to the Pope, the Crusades, and perhaps a few inappropriate Bible passages, thinking that they've grasped the spirit of Christianity. That annoys me, and that's why we thought, when we talk about Islam, we want to undertake a broader introduction for people, primarily for people from our or other Christian communities who are interested in learning more. How is it exactly with Islam, with the Quran, with Muslims? And start a dialogue alongside this broader introduction. Whether we succeed in doing so, looking around here, whether many who are not Christians but probably Muslims have found their way here, I don't know yet. In any case, we have invited widely there, and we have seen in our speakers that we do not just borrow people with a Christian background to tell something about Islam, but Muslims with very different attitudes. Very different, but they're not the entire very wide range that exists. As an explicitly liberal, undogmatic church community, we've stated that we find it particularly compelling to also engage those within Islam who would identify themselves as exploring a liberal form of Islam. We're seeking that, and it's an ideal we aspire to. We didn't want to limit it to only that, but that's the reason we've invited several individuals to represent that perspective. And we've contextualized this event within the Reformation anniversary. It started 500 years ago, in the year 1517, when the Reformation began with Martin Luther's thesis. We did this because we thought it was unwise if we in the Church only discussed reformations in a rearward sense and turned it into a grand historical event, instead of asking ourselves, what is indeed one of our major responsibilities today? And one of our tasks is how we position ourselves towards Islam, towards our Muslim compatriots. And when I say, however, we were very adamant here that it wasn't just a positioning brimming with prejudices and stereotyping, but one filled with mutual perception at an equal level, infused with respect and tolerance. We are thrilled with all 6 top-class speakers who are each very notable for this subject of Christian-Muslim dialogue, and we're delighted that we have secured a highly accomplished expert for this inaugural evening. A preliminary introduction to the Quran primarily, but through it to Islam as well. Hartmut Bobzin, Professor Dr. Hartmut Bobzin, the professor, now emeritus professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Erlangen, Nuremberg. He was born here in Bremen and baptized in the Church of the Resurrection in Hastedt. As he shared with me, and I believe he was also confirmed there. A stalwart Bremen native, he studied Protestant theology and religious science, Semitic and Arabian studies, even Indology in Marburg and Damascus. He acquired his teaching certification in Semitic philology and Islamic studies, and his postdoctoral thesis at that time was titled The Koran in the Age of the Reformation. This finds a beautiful fit for such a series here, because one of his interests is also the study of how the Quran has been received over the years. How has the original text been received in the Christian West over the centuries? He's written very famous and widely distributed introductions to the Quran and to the person of Muhammad. You can literally buy those at the station kiosks in the Beck series, with concise but solid introductions. And by the way, you can also buy it at our book table over there today. The introduction to the Quran that carries the same title as our event tonight, the Quran, an introduction. In 2010, Hartmut Bobzin then presented his own Quran translation, which among experts is considered one of the best, if not the best German, in any case, a very also up-to-date on the scientific discussion and linguistically on the cutting edge, a Quran translation. You can even take those with you later. Today it's about a general introduction, and I'm thrilled that so many want to participate. How have we thought about the process? The lecture is about to start. There will be a chance for questions afterwards, but we've thought that we might start with small group discussions, and you with the cards that you found on your seats, but of course left them all over there so that we could then formulate questions. We will manage this very disciplinedly. We are keen on not just having a monologue, but also giving those who are present today the opportunity to ask questions and have a conversation, to have a discussion. And we don't want to take an infinite amount of time for the discussion. There can still be an informal conclusion in the end. There will be a recording of the whole event when it is technically finished. Yes, I get the thumbs up, that's great. Many thanks also to Carsten Lehmann, who had already set up everything over there and now here again. And we thought of it in such a way that when the turn is over, we might have the lectures of all 6 speakers, and then we can publish them again in writing. I had already said about the book table that it exists, thanks to the Melcher's bookstore. There you can get books by Hartmut Bobzin, but also by others, or take a look and order books. There are even book tips for each of our speakers, wonderfully prepared. So now it's really high time that Prof. Dr. Hartmut Bobzin, the Quran, an introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, when I died in 1966 on 28, I can credibly assure you that I didn't really have a clue about Islam. That didn't even happen at school. I also learned Hebrew from a cathedral preacher during my high school years, which was very useful to me later. But there was never really any talk of Islam. And I can tell you even more, namely that Martin Luther also translated parts of the Quran. So he was not only a translator of the Bible, but he also dealt very intensively with the Quran. However, that would be
so wonderful. Of course, Luther couldn't speak Arabic. I mean, at that time, there were perhaps a handful of scholars who were fluent in Arabic. They existed already. But he was interested in it for other reasons. It was the time of the Turkish wars. Yes, and Luther wrote 2 texts in 1527. Here he preaches again to the Turks and an exhortation to prayer again to the Turks. And these are very interesting books which I also studied and have already published something about them. That was a long time ago in the journal Neue Zeitschrift für Systematische Theologie und Religionswissenschaft. But as I said, if you celebrate the Reformation anniversary, then you need to say something about the fact that Luther dealt with Islam. Of course, in the shadow of the Turkish wars of that time, that was, so to speak, the engine that drove Luther to engage with it as well. Well, I'm now going to introduce you to the Quran and try to show you a thing or two. So I've brought along a whole collection of Quran books. Now I must first say that the Quran is not actually a book at all. The question is, what is the Quran then? The Quran is actually the revelation of God. A revelation of God that was communicated to Muhammad through the intervention of the Archangel Gabriel. And the writing of the Quran, meaning that the Quran was, so to speak, written down, is a very late process. So it took about 100 years, so to speak, from the proclamation to the first writing. Then, and take note of this, I emphasize it with particular emphasis, the printing press has only existed in the Islamic world since about 1800. This means the oldest printed Qurans in the Orient have only existed since that time. So it's a completely different process of transmission, and the time frames are completely different than the writing of the Bible, for example. You have to keep this in mind. And so here I'll show you some things known from the Quran. You can come closer later and take a closer look at it. I could start with something very small. Here, this little thing, half a matchbox, which is a complete Quran. Yes. This here. This is more related because it's a book that follows the actual Oriental form of books, so to speak. It has a flap, a so-called tongue, a lisan. This is closed, so to speak, and then it's placed on the shelf. Yes, in the Orient, books are not kept upright, they are laid down. And here also, this is now here. Because it's a modern book, it's not the case. There is also a label for what's inside the book. Yes. And this is a Persian edition of the Quran here. Yes, but I'm telling you now, there is no Persian translation of the Quran. In fact, there are no translations of the Quran. There is just a kind of imitation of what's meant, or a reproduction of the meaning of the Quran in a very specific language. So it's a very complicated process, yes. But nowadays, even the country Saudi Arabia is printing the Quran. This means there is a very large Quran located in Medina, what I call a Quran work, similar to how we have the Bible work in Germany. Yes, they print Qurans and also Quran translations. The printing of the Quran, that means over time, Islam has to a certain extent adapted itself to the pressure of the audience, also to the needs of the audience, and has moved away from very specific dogmas. So the Quran is actually widely available today, although it is so... I mean, you may have this experience yourself if you go to an Oriental country and want to buy a Quran. Then you have to be prepared that the people say it is not for you, or what do you have? Why do you want to buy the Quran? If you are a Christian, you don't need the Quran at all, or it's now forbidden to read it. This is another aspect of this. So definitely know this. When you go to this counterworld, try to acquire a Quran. You have to experience that yourself, so to speak, experience. The Quran consists of 114, yes, chapters. I hesitate to pronounce, that's the word. It actually means a surah. A surah, in Arabic surah, with a sharp S that's probably developed from a Hebrew word into Arabic. And that's just a special name that is only used for Quran chapters in Arabic. Yes, so that is very important. No other book would have surahs, so to speak, would have surahs and the arrangement of the surahs, which is now very strange indeed. It seems to be that it is strange you will do that again and again when you open the Quran. Then you make the observation that although the first surah is relatively short, it is in like 7 verses, so to speak, but the second surah is about 1/9 of the entire book. And then follow the remaining 112 surahs. So generally speaking, in decreasing length, that is the longest surah with a total of 285 verses of varying length is at the beginning. And then they sort of get shorter apart from surah 112, which is only made up of 3 lines and 3 verses. The last 2 surahs are a special case, so to speak. These are called apotropaic surahs, which are used to fend off evil, so to speak. They kind of stand out, but the actual Quran consists of the opening surah, the so-called opening of Surah 2, called the cow. I'll explain why it's called that in a moment. And then it's the longest surah with 285 verses, and it continues to the very last surahs. And it simply keeps getting shorter. Now, why is that, I ask you? Are you familiar with the New Testament? I'm glad if you open the New Testament, then I'd recommend that you open the corpus of Pauline letters. The letters of Paul, they are in fact arranged by length. The longest letter of the Romans is at the beginning and the shortest. Philemon is at the end. Yes, and that was a common classification of books in antiquity, which has not been applied to the entire, really very complicated corpus of the New Testament. I'm not even going to talk about the Old Testament, it's much more complicated. But this is an ancient, proven division of books in antiquity, which has also been reflected here in the Quran, so there's really nothing special about it. Yes, you can just get used to it. Yes, now that's the question of the surah's arrangement. And the question is, are there any substantive classification criteria then? I must say, unfortunately, that doesn't exist. Actually, one can say that the Quran is a kind of collection of psalms. So the Psalter, you can best compare it with the Quran, which, by the way, has also been done in the history of calligraphy. the art of beautiful writing, that is how Qurans are made. I will say a few more things about that in a moment. So that's a corpus of texts that is very diverse. For example, there are also accounts of creation and other things that can be read in the Psalms, but it is not ordered, it obeys a different order. I think that ordering the Psalms is also a very difficult task for theologians. And so there are a wide variety of possible solutions, which of course also exist in the Quran. Yes, so to get practical right now, I can offer you a recommendation. Firstly, of course, you should read the first search. That's a given. That essentially is like a sort of psalm. Let me read it to you in my own translation. In the name of God, the most merciful, the merciful, praise be to God, the Lord of all worlds' inhabitants, the most merciful, the ruler of judgment. Excuse me, the ruler of the day of judgment. To you whom we call upon you for help, guide us to the right path, the path of those whom you have graced, not of those upon whom you are angry, nor of those who go astray. So once more, in the name of God, the most merciful, praise be to God, the Lord of all the world's inhabitants, the most merciful, the ruler of the day of judgment. To you whom we call upon you for help, guide us to the right path, the path of those whom you have graced, not of those who are angry, nor of those who go astray. Yes, and if they turn a page now, yes, then the surah is called the Q. Well, even Martin Luther made a lot of fun of it. So why is one surah called Q, then another surah is called the ants, a surah is called the bees? Why? And Luther did not judge it so positively. Well, that has to do with the fact that the surahs were named, so to speak, after some piece of text, or particularly remarkable things. I'll read you one from the surah, the ants, which is quite impressive. Yes, so here I start with the Q al-Baqarah, which begins with the following words. By the way, every surah begins with the formula in the name of God, the Merciful, Erbamas. Yes, so that's actually like a kind of legal rule, yes, like in the name of the law. So it sounds like a legal text, which it is. That's what the Quran is, in many cases. But of course, the Quran isn't just a legal text, which means that the Quran and Islamic law, the so-called Sharia, aren't identical. The Quran is only a part of it, but that's important, so to speak. So here again, in Surah 2, like every surah, it begins with, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. And then something very strange comes up, which occurs in different surahs. Alif, Lam, Mim. These are 3 letters, designations. I wish I could tell you what that actually means. So the scientific consensus is that it's an abbreviation or a collective note where certain surahs, certain revelations were collected under this symbol. But to this day, we haven't figured out what the actual philological explanation of these things is. Of course, there are many explanations, but they are actually not convincing. And then the search begins with the following text. This is the book in which there is no doubt. It is a guide for the godly who believe in what is hidden, who establish prayer, and who give from what we have provided for them. Those who believe in what has been revealed to you and what has come down before you, and who have the certainty of the hereafter. They are led by their Lord, and they are the ones who prosper. So this is already a text that is actually very understandable, and it also sounds as if a book can be opened with it, so to speak. A text can be opened. And if you look back now at the small searches, that is the short searches, there is now a very important search, search 112, so it's the second to last search, no, the second to last but one. The pure confession of God states, in God's name the merciful, the compassionate, say, He is God, the one and only, God the everlasting. He did not father and was not fathered, and no one is comparable to Him. Now, as a translator, it often happens that the text has already been translated, yes, and of course one cannot imitate another translator. And thus this search has been translated by Ruckert in a masterful form, Friedrich Ruckert, and the text reads as follows. Say, God is one, an eternally pure one. He did not father, and none has fathered Him, and none equals Him. So you see, that rhymes, yes, and that is a characteristic of the Quran, that the Quran is written in a type of rhyme prose. And if you now want to translate the Quran, if you want to always imitate the rhyme in a suitable Quran translation, so to speak, yes, then you need a lot of time. Yes, because even with the best intentions and the dictionaries, you sometimes don't have enough time to look everything up, so to speak. Please bear the following in mind. Arabic is one of the great world languages and one of the most widely used colloquial languages, which effectively span the entire world, so to speak. But to this day there is nothing that corresponds to the great German dictionary. Yes, that is, the Arabs of the Middle Ages mainly created rhyming dictionaries to allow poets to rhyme, so to speak, but they did not create a historical critical dictionary like the brothers Grimm did for us in German. This means that even as a translator of the Quran, you are often groping around in the fog, so to speak, and now have to read a great deal of Arabic literature. And what you have to read here is primarily the following, namely the pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, which was actually also orally transmitted poetry. And for this poetic language, there is indeed all sorts of lexical material, so that you can, so to speak, work with it. And of course, I did that as well. And then you can also progress with the Quran. Unfortunately, I have made several attempts to somehow acquire funds from the wealthy sheikdoms, but they are not interested. They do not want that. They would rather finance poets and so on, who, so to speak, write songs of praise for them, with rhyme dictionaries, of course, which are abundantly available. But they are not willing to finance such a dictionary at this time, which would really advance science, that is, what is actually in the Quran. Because it is enough, and this is where the problems begin, it is not enough in Arabic alone. Yes, to master Arabic. Let me explain it to you with an example. There is a lot of talk about Jesus in the Quran, and Jesus, as the son of Mary, so to speak, is the only woman who is mentioned by name in the Quran, Mary. So Rita in Maryam means Jesus in Arabic. And so the terminology that is now used for Jesus, such as the word for the disciples or the gospel, these are all words that do not come from Arabic, but are loan words from Ethiopian. One might ask, why from Ethiopian in particular? Yes, there is an episode in the tradition about the life of Muhammad, that Muhammad, after he had started preaching and received the revelation, he was being treated with hostility by the Arab population, and that he looked around to escape it. And that's when he turned to Ethiopia. At least part of his community did, not Muhammad himself. And they came into contact with the Ethiopians, a Christian kingdom, the so-called Solomonic dynasty. That's why there are Ethiopian elements in the Quran. Yes, and as a scholar of the Quran, you must take note of this. For example, the Gospel is called Injil, Injil. This is related to the Ethiopian word Wangal. I believe you can understand by listening, or the disciples. Yes, you could form something else in Arabic, but that is not formed, it is formed from Ethiopian. And it's very important to take this into account. Yes. I keep making attempts, so to speak, starting again, if we ask again, what is the Quran? What is the Quran? We now agree that it wasn't necessarily sent down as a book from the beginning, yes. Rather, it is the revelation of God to Muhammad, which was passed on through the angel Gabriel. The angels play a big role in Islam. Please take note of that. They're not like... They don't belong in some kind of sweet circle of ideas. It's a reality for Islam. The angels, the belief in the angels. People and angels play a big role for the whole of theology and anthropology too. It was revealed in individual revelations, and that's where the problem of the Quran begins. If you want to read the Quran, so to speak, Islamic science has really put a lot of work into it in certain branches of science, always researching the occasion for a specific revelation. Why did God just now again mediate through the angel Gabriel? Why did he let such a revelation descend? Or not just letting it come down, but I also want to explain that there are different notions of how to envision the revelation. And in any case, as I've already mentioned, it came in Arabic, but also with certain aspects that one must know, like the influence of the Ethiopian language. And then everything was collected. In other words, the oral revelations were gathered under the third caliph, Osman. So to say it in European or Turkish, you could say that Osman ruled from 644 to 656. So during that time, the Quran was, so to speak, collected or compiled, but of course not yet written. I must tell you that, of course, the history of the Arabic script is also a complex field. So the oldest written pieces of evidence, there are some, so to speak, Pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions, but the development of writing, yes, that is actually only beginning, or even of the various artistic fonts, is only just beginning with Islam. So to speak, you also have materials, handwritten materials, where you can also see how old are certain signatures. So there's also a consensus, of course, the science, how to judge that, so to speak. Now the first Arabic Quran, Druk, has been published, so I have seen it myself. There is only one copy of it. It was printed in Venice in 1537-38. Yes, and the question, why is there only one specimen? Yes, there is a species, so to speak. There are certain reports about it, that the Venetian printers sensed a good deal and thought that they could print the Quran, so to speak. And the Turkish Sultan would certainly be very pleased if he had an Arabic Quran now, so to speak. But when the Turkish Sultan or his scholars, who of course were also fluent in Arabic, had they seen this Quran, they would not have been, as I can assure you, at all enlightened, because this Quranic text was so incorrect that it didn't even have a chance of being printed, mainly due to its falseness. In other words, it was not correct. It didn't adhere to the ideal of perfection that obviously exists in Islam, especially with the Quran. So this Quran printed in Venice in 1537-38, it's the first printing, but it has its own story. I have also written an essay about it. You can find that under my name in any library catalogue. Anyway, it is not the case that a Quran was burned at the Pope's behest. This legend was launched by Hans Kungen, leader of God, a few years ago. That never happened, a Quran printing. Qurans weren't burned, but destroyed in some other way, so that's a legend anyway. Well, Quran prints have only existed since, I said it already, since about 1800 in the Islamic world. Before that, there were only manuscripts. Nowadays it's natural, I've already hinted at that. Nowadays there's no longer a problem, so to speak. A Quran is probably for sale. You can print it, you can buy it. I have a whole collection of Qurans myself, and therein lies no problem, so to speak. Now, I've spoken about the Quran so far, and have not yet said anything about the recipient for whom it was actually intended, namely about Muhammad. So Muhammad's full name is Muhammad ibn Abdallah, which is Muhammad, the son of the servant of God. His lifetime is assumed to be about 570 to 632, although only the date of death is really relatively certain, but not the date of birth. This has only been calculated backwards, so to speak, based on reports, inner Islamic reports that claim Muhammad was about a mature age when he received the revelation. Yes, and then you calculate about 40 years. And if you then calculate backwards from his death and look at the length of the entire text, Genesis, then you come up with an estimated age of about 570 to 632 for Muhammad. Now he was raised in Mecca. Now Mecca. I don't have a map now, but I'm assuming you know where that is. So this is Western Arabia. Yes, and Mecca is an ancient sanctuary. In the Quran itself, it is referred to as the old house. So already in Roman times, it is attested by the geographer Ptolemy, who speaks of Makoraba in the Latin of that time. That is, it is indeed an old sanctuary that was known in antiquity. Of course, there are now within Islam all sorts of legends about the history of Mecca, the founding of the Kaaba, etc. This Kaaba, yes, it is a peculiar building. It is a sort of cube. Kaaba also means cube in Arabic, And you see, so I think you all somehow have a picture now of what the Kaaba looks like. Over it is hung a cloth, yes, and this cloth is replaced once a year. Now first the cloth, and then what is essentially beneath the cloth. This cloth was formerly, or for a long time, the privilege of the Egyptian rulers to produce. It was always brought to Mecca in a special caravan, and then on a very specific day it was exchanged and replaced with this new cloth. Yes, and what's underneath the Kaaba or under this cloth? It's a building made of block stones, and there's also an entrance door that is quite high up, not at ground level, and that's because the valley of Mecca, the Wadi, was repeatedly threatened by flooding. Yes, if you want to investigate, I don't have photographs here now. The last time there was a real flood, where there are photos of people with their legs in the water, was during World War II, 40 years ago. Yes, it's always been the responsibility of the rulers of Mecca, the Sharif of Mecca, to ensure that the Kaaba is protected from such floods, which are something you always have to be prepared for in such wadis. In any case, the old house plays a very important role and is therefore causally linked to the revelation to Muhammad ibn Abdallah, who grew up in Mecca. Now, the second center of the Islamic world is the city of Medina. Here it's about 400 kilometers north of Mecca, and this city was already known in ancient times. In Ptolemy's case, it's called the city of Yathriba or Yathripa. It also appears in the Quran once in this form, Yathrib, but was then called Medina, which means the city or the state. Yes, or today it is also called Madinat an-Nabi, which means the city of the Prophet. Yes, whether this is actually true is debatable. I don't want to argue about that, because interestingly enough, the same word Medina is also the name for this state in Hebrew, the language of Israel. Yes, it is, so to speak, at least a word in Hebrew. It is closely intertwined with Arabic that denotes, so to speak, a kind of state. That is, so to speak, the city where Islam actually found its form, because then, besides Mecca as the holy city, Medina was considered the city of the Prophet, where the highly revered Prophet's mosque exists. Well, I've never been there myself, as I'm not a Muslim, and non-Muslims are not allowed to enter the city. There were some Germans in the past who dared to do this, but it's life-threatening if you're not a Muslim. I didn't want to tempt fate. Now, more testimonies for the time of the creation of the Quran. It is, so to speak, the simultaneity with the Eastern Roman Emperor Heraclius, who lived from 610 to 641. This Eastern Roman Empire, also called Byzantium, today's Istanbul, Byzantium, is the ancient Greek name, which is why we specifically refer to the Byzantine Empire, which only fell in 1453. So it is essentially the end of antiquity. This Eastern Roman Empire was, of course, a significant partner of the Islamic world. One can only understand the Quran in many aspects if you pay simultaneous attention to what was happening in Byzantium at that time, and one is also reasonably informed about it. So it's very important to take note of this. Another empire which was powerful during the time of Muhammad and also exerted a certain influence on early Islam was the New Persian Empire. The New Persian Empire is of around 224 AD. These New Persians, they're named after a specific tribe, the Sassanids. So the Sassanids, they were a very powerful empire. So around 1614, they stole the Holy Cross from Jerusalem, but then gave it back 16 years later. This defeat of the Persians, you might possibly find it in the Quran. Because in a search 30, it's said that as it were, the Persians were defeated, or rather the Eastern Roman Empire was defeated. It happens here again, as with many other things, that the text of the Quran isn't quite clear. Why isn't it clear? To this I may have to add something else, something that I haven't mentioned yet. Arabic is a consonant, so the Arabic script is a consonantal script, which means that only the consonants and long vowels are written, but nothing else. In older times, even the long vowels did not exist. This means it's very difficult to read this text if you're reading such old manuscripts. You need to have a certain training to guess it, so to speak. Give it a try, do an experiment, and leave out the vowels when you write a German text. To what extent can you read it without problems? It works somehow. Yes, it works. But the Arabic script is much more extreme. Those of you who know Hebrew know the problems that this very related language offers. Well, the Third Reich, which I've already mentioned and which played a role in early Islam, was the Ethiopian Empire of Aksum from the 1st century AD onwards. It became Christian in the middle of the 4th century. And the ruler of this kingdom is the so-called Negus, or Negus Negister, that is, the King of Kings. And that is very important, I already emphasized this, that the Ethiopian must always be taken into account if you want to understand the Quran, because there is, so to speak, this, so to speak, now justified by the biography of Muhammad and his followers, this aspect in early Islamic history. Well, I may now go a little further and try to explain to you, yes, how could such a religion as Islam come about in Arabia at all? What was actually going on in Arabia? Yes, so a common prejudice says, yes, Arabia, that was, so to speak, in a shadowy corner of world history. Yes, nothing really happened there, yes. Or rather, you really don't know what happened, and you still don't know exactly to this day. So sources on this, that is, written sources, but also oral sources, are very rare indeed. Well, first of all, one assumes that there was something like, yes, so-called tribal religions. Stones, trees, etc. were worshipped. We're familiar with this from the Old Testament. So marriage, for instance, that's just a stone. The Old Testament naturally provides many illustrations for the Quran. There was a famous Old Testament scholar, Julius Wellhausen, who was also an Arabist. So that kind of expertise pays off. Then during Muhammad's time there were Jews in Arabia. So the Jews, they haven't disappeared from the scene, so to speak, but some have migrated south. We can trace until recent times that there were various Jewish communities in Arabia. And they're also mentioned in the Quran as Yahud in Arabic. And then, of course, there were Christians. Christians were present during the emergence of Islam in Arabia. Well, these Christians have a unique name in Arabic. They're called Nasara. And at first you might be thinking of Nazareth. This could be connected to Nazareth. Maybe or maybe not. But Muslim scholars say this is connected to an Arabic verb, Nazareth. This means to help, so to speak. They were actually the aides, as it were, the aides of Muhammad. So to what extent this is actually convincing, I can't really say for sure. But in any case, something that was definitely also in Arabia, of course, was the Greek Orthodox. In other words, offshoots of the Greek Orthodox Byzantine Church, so to speak. Yes, they're usually called the so-called Melkites. Yes, that goes back to the word for the king. In other words, the emperor, really. These are the Byzantines. Yes, so these Christians followed the Byzantine rite, so to speak. Yes, of course, they were so-called non-Orthodox Byzantines. I mean, they just couldn't live in the Byzantine Empire because they were heavily persecuted, and they essentially took refuge just outside the borders of the Grand Byzantine Empire and found sanctuary in Arabia. Now, another important denomination of Christianity during Muhammad's time in Arabia was the so-called Nestorians. Yes, the members of this church today don't like to hear this word anymore. Yes, they can trace their origins back to the Byzantine patriarch Nestorius, who reigned from 428 to 431. They primarily emphasized the human nature of Christ. Yes, that's really important. In that sense, they have a much closer proximity to Islam. Yes, what is written in the Quran is a very clear rejection of the Trinity. Yes, essentially the human nature of Christ is emphasized by Jesus, but not his divine nature. Yes, a second group, kind of a subsidiary to the Nestorians, are the so-called Jacobites, named after Jacob Baradai, who died in 1578. They emphasized Christ's divine nature. Yes, this is also reflected in today's Eastern Church landscape. For example, the Copts in Egypt. They, in the broadest sense, belong to this group of Jacobites. They are not called Jacobites. Now, it's so complicated that I don't want to explain it here. It was very important that these types of Christians existed on the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, there were Jewish Christians already mentioned in the New Testament. We know the least about them because there are hardly any traditions about them. One thing is certain, there were monotheists in Arabia at the time of Muhammad. Yes, and these monotheists were later represented in Arab countries. Special groups are also mentioned. A group that is also mentioned in the Koran and in the early Islamic tradition. These are the so-called Hanifs, Hanif. This Arabic word actually means heretic. Yes, but it is often the case, you can also see in the Christian heretic history, that swear words have often become accepted words, but then have a positive meaning. In any case, there were these seekers of God, and Muhammad owed a lot to them. There was another group, also mentioned in the Quran, the so-called Sabir with a sharp S. So that's a kind of, you actually know very little about them. In any case, they are related to groups of baptisms, that is, Anabaptists. It must have been an Anabaptist group. This is, of course, difficult in Western Arabia. Aside from the flash floods that can occur in wadis, there is actually no such regular water supply, which a Baptist group would need, so to speak, if they wanted to practice their religion. So who these Sabir actually are, you have to question. But the group that now appears in the Arabic Quran is a little better known as the group of the Magus, or the Magi. Yes, you guessed it, it's something Persian. So I'm just throwing the name Zoroaster into the room here. Yes, they are followers of Zoroaster. And this Persian religion, the followers of Zoroaster, they were the state religion in the new Persian Empire at the time of Muhammad. And of course, they have also left certain traces in Islam. Yes, at least these are called Majus in the Quran. If I recall correctly, only once, but as I said, they have also had an influence. The Quran itself gives a beautiful verse in Surah 22, verse 17, which reads as follows: "Look, those who are believers and are Jews, and the Sabians and the Christians and the Zoroastrians and the polytheists, in Arabic al-Mushrikun. Look, God decides between them on the day of resurrection. Look, God is a witness over everything." Again, 22:17. Look, those who are believers and are Jews, and the Sabians and the Christians and the Zoroastrians and the polytheists. Look, God decides between them on the day of resurrection. Look, God is a witness over everything. So you see, the resurrection is mentioned here. Yes, God decides on the day of resurrection. The resurrection plays a big role in Islam. Yes, so don't think that that's something that's sort of kind of up for grabs. Now, Muhammad had various visions, so he was also a visionary, though it's still the case that the Quran is actually a revelation through the word, so not through visions, so to speak, not through visions. But there is a vision that I want to tell you, or read aloud, because it plays a major role. It's in Surah 53 and is called thus. This search is called the star. And I read it to you here in the translation of Rakkat. By the star that twinkles, your companion neither errs nor strays. He does not speak out of his own desire. It is what is revealed to him. He is taught by a high-striving mighty one, stands hovering, soaring high in the sky. Then he approached and came down. And he was 2 cubits wide and less. And he revealed to his servant what he revealed to him. The heart did not lie what the eye perceived. Will you deny him what he perceived? Then the other time he was at the trembling tree at the boundary post. The trembling tree clothed itself. He did not waver or wander. His gaze was one of fear. He saw the biggest sign of his Lord. That is, in a way, describing a vision. I will read a second one for you, which is Surah 81. These are verses 15 to 29. It says as follows: Should I swear by the planets, the wanderers, the unsettled, and by the desolate night and the waking dawn, the word is worthy of a messenger, a strong messenger who stands honored by the Lord of the throne. A faithful master, your countryman does not err or deceive. He saw him glorified on high, and he will not hoard what he saw and heard. It is not the word of one who has revolted. Where are you running to, shocked? It is only a reminder to the worlds, for whoever wants to accept the truth from you. But you do not want to. If not, it is God's will, the Lord of the worlds. So this is another vision which I have also read to you here in the translation of Rukot. Normally, however, it is assumed, or rather this is the conviction of the Muslims, so to speak, that the actual vocation of Muhammad is encapsulated in a surah which is called the Coagulated, and that is Surah 96, which reads as follows. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from tough blood. Read, it is your Lord who chose you, who instructed you with the scribe's pen, instructed man in what he does not know before. I'll read it to you again in Arabic, because there you can also see how it rhymes, so to speak, and how beautiful it sounds. Please excuse me, but for my eyesight I need a somewhat larger Quran here. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from tough blood. Read, it is your Lord who chose you, who instructed you with the scribe's pen, instructed man in what he does not know before. Read in the name of your Lord who created man out of a clot of blood. Read, your Lord who favored you, has taught you with the pen, taught mankind what they didn't know before. This is what is considered the oldest search, so to say, because here the word Ikra, from which the word Koran is derived, essentially the scripture, the text that is recited because it is mentioned here and has its own persuasive power. Well, I don't know. I think my time is almost up, isn't it? Excuse me? It's just been an hour, yes. So I'm also nearing the end, so rest assured this wouldn't be endless. I only want to tell you that in the Quran, Muhammad is only mentioned 4 times in total. Yes, so if you want to note down these verses, they are Surah 3, verse 144, Surah 33, verse 40, Surah 47, verses 1-2, and Surah 48, verse 29. I'm only going to recite one verse from this, specifically verse 3. Anyway, you can see this much. The Quran doesn't have a biographical interest in Muhammad. This is a different genre, so to speak. There are reports about Muhammad, about Muhammad's life and so on, which are also very popular, but the Quran only hints at this. Here in Surah 3 it says, Muhammad is nothing but a messenger who was preceded by other messengers. If he dies or is killed, will you turn your backs, turn away from him? Whoever turns his back will do no harm to God, but God will reward the steadfast. The other passages are similar, so you can't build a Muhammad biography on them. Now, one more thing is very important. Muhammad himself, there are two words for the Prophet, so to speak, his function. One function is that he's the God's messenger, which is also called Rasul in Arabic. And the other title is Nabi. Nabi, this warms the heart of all theologians here. Yes, it already appears in the Old Testament. So the prophets, they're referred to by the same name. But in the Quran, one thing can be clearly stated. This title, Rasul, which is essentially a new title that means messenger, has no genealogical or other historical backgrounds at all. While the Nabi, so to speak, who is called Nabi, is always rooted in Judeo-Christian salvation history. So all the prophets in the Quran who bear this title Nabi can now find themselves in Christian Jewish history. So that's very important. And Muhammad now promises another one, so to speak, who will come after him. Yes, in Surah 61, verse 6. So this is a very frequently quoted surah that is also very dear to Muslims. When Jesus, the son of Mary, said, "Children of Israel, behold, I have been sent by God to you to confirm the things of the law before me, and to announce a messenger who is coming after me, whose name is Ahmad." When he came to them with the evidence, they said, "This is clear magic." Well, that's not true at all. Yes, now one must know the following. This word Ahmad, which basically means the same as Muhammad, that is, the highly praiseworthy, or so to speak, the highly praised. And now I have to disappoint her again, of course. So as a historian, you also have to say whether this person really existed. Well, that's hard to say. The name is attested. I mean, you also have North Arabic inscriptions, so to speak, graffiti, where the name already appears. It belongs, so to speak, to the inventory of names, of ancient Arabic names, but this is this promised Ahmad, so to speak. Now on to something else very important. I'm going to mention some sections to you, and I'll just read one of them. A theory that's crucial to early Islam is the notion of the so-called scriptural falsification. Muslims generally accuse Christians and Jews of having falsified the scriptures. There's a very specific Arabic word for it, tarif. What it exactly means is unclear. I apologize for having to bring up so many question marks, but as a philologist, I can only rely on what I know and what I am convinced of, which right now seems to be true and convincing. 4 verse 46, then in Surah 5 verses 13 and 41, and Surah 2 verse 75. Here one finds traces of the so-called falsification of the Quran. I'll read to you from verse 4, Surah 4, verse 46. Some of the Jews move words from their place and speak. We hear and disobey, hear without understanding, and twist their tongues. However, if they had said, "We hear and obey, listen and look upon us," it would have been good and proper for them. But God has cursed them because of their unbelief, so they believe little. This theory, which I could present to you convincingly now, can be developed by comparing Arabic and Hebrew. Indeed, it's true that a Hebrew quote is being utilized in a manner of speaking, which is quite a debated subject among both Muslim and non-Muslim scholars. One more thing. The prophets mentioned in the Quran are the following: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Lot, Ismail, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Aaron, Samuel. By the way, he is not directly mentioned, but it is clear that he is being referred to. Then Job, David, Solomon, Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, John the Baptist, and of course Jesus, the son of Mary. Yes, and Jesus is the only one who has this term attached to him, so to speak, the Son of Mary. Yes, sometimes he is just referred to as the Son of Mary. Well, I've already hinted at this, revelation, which is actually what revelation is all about. Yes, in the imaginative horizon of the Quran, two images are essentially needed for this. So either the revelation comes from above, like the rain falls down, so to speak. The word is also used, that is, even if it's raining, let's say now, or someone, so to speak, is standing behind you and whispering something in your ear, so to speak, on the one hand vertically, on the other hand horizontally. Yes, the two concepts of revelation are those, and both play a major role. So the Quran itself is also called tansil, that is, as descent, or this word wahi in Arabic. Yes, maybe one more. And then I'll stop right away. Something that will surprise you, and of course is also something that basically surprises Muslims over and over again when they are told that. I mean, it's just the question of how they interpret certain statements of the Quran. So I'm now reading Surah 33, verse 7 for you here. It says as follows: And back then, when we made a covenant with the prophets, with you, that is Muhammad, with Noah, with Abraham, with Moses, and with Jesus, son of Mary, we made a firm covenant with them. Well, what follows from that? That the new covenant, or the most recent covenant, is actually Islam. Yes, because a covenant has now been made with Muhammad. So you can understand the whole thing in the image of federal theology and also understand Islam. But I'm telling you that what I'm describing to you here now, that also follows from the Quran. So if you discuss this with a Muslim now, yes, then he will probably see it differently or interpret it differently. Yes, that has to do with what you are now being called. Bring knowledge, something they can relate to. So in this case, I'm saying they know the Old Testament or the New Testament, and then it's obviously clear. But the entire subject, to what extent is Islam, so to speak, dependent on Judaism and Christianity, is of course a highly debated issue. Yes, another passage now about Muhammad being foretold in the Quran. It says in Surah 7, verse 157, these are the fortunate ones. Well, that's Surah 7, verse 157. And they can use that. Many Muslims relate to Muhammad. And this prophet after Moses also appears in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 18, chapter 18, verse 15 and verse 18. A prophet like me, Yahweh, your God would raise from amongst your brothers. Listen to him. And I will raise a prophet like you for them from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will have to declare everything that I command him. Another announcement from the New Testament plays a role in the Quran, the so-called Paraclete from the Gospel of John. But the Helper, the Holy Spirit, already a stumbling block in the New Testament, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and remind you of everything I have told you. When the Helper comes, whom I will send you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who proceeds from the Father, he will testify about me. So to speak, that you could also understand this, it doesn't mean that Jesus himself, so to speak, predicted Muhammad. And now back to the scripture, Surah 4, verse 171. You people of the book, it says here, it always refers to Jews and Christians. Don't go too far in your religion and say nothing but the truth about God. For behold, the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, is God's messenger and his word, which he placed in Mary, and a spirit from him. So believe in God and his messengers, and do not say three. Stop it, it would be better for you. For behold, God is a single God. Far be it from him to have children, or far be it from him to have a son. You can't clearly distinguish in Arabic how to translate this, but this is a really very important point here, Surah 4, verse 171. And this is confirmed again in Surah 5, verse 15. People of the scripture, our messenger has come to you. He makes clear to you much of what you hid from the scripture, and he forgives you much. Light and a clear book have come to you from God. And Surah 5, verse 116. And when God said, O Jesus, son of Mary, did you tell people to take me and my mother as gods besides God? He said, Blessed are you. It isn't for me to say something I have no right to say. So this is also a really very important verse, the Quran's concept of the Trinity. And considering the whole Marian cult of the Catholic Church, this is also a very hotly debated matter. To what extent this really, because it's very biblical, the Mother of God, so to speak. Many people don't realize that Marian worship is quite common in Islam. Muslim mothers in Egypt and Lebanon often seek blessings for their children from Mary. I've seen it with my own eyes. And now to the final point, the Quranic concept of oneness. Oneness, essentially, is the aim of Islam. Refer to Surah 112. He, God, is one. God the everlasting, did not procreate, nor was he procreated, and no one equals him. And just a small aside, it's not in my manuscript, but it's something possibly interesting. What is translated here as God the everlasting and is often spoken by Muslims is called as-samad. We don't know exactly what this word means. This is exactly the same case as we also have a word in the Lord's Prayer that no one knows exactly what it means. Namely the request, "Give us our daily bread today." Whoever knows that will receive a double Nobel Prize in literature. But I think you have to live with that. To say this at the end, that there are words in the Holy Scriptures where you don't know exactly what they mean. And of course you have to somehow, yes, you have to accept it or live with it in one way or another, understand how you want to understand it. Thank you for your attention and for your patience in putting up with me for so long. And we thank you, Professor Bobzin, for your lecture. There should be an opportunity now, and some are already taking advantage of it, for those who have planned it accordingly to leave the place now. But there should also be an opportunity to ask questions. That's why I think it would be good if we exchanged a few minutes, really only 3 minutes, with the neighbors. What was completely new to me today? What had I never heard before? Or what do I feel is the central statement now, so to speak? Then we'll let the others go out in the meantime and come back right away and see how we get into conversation.